Welcome to the 10th edition of the COP interview series hosted by the UN Women Training Center's Community of Practice, the COP. My name is Ria Ligari. I'm the COP and Virtual Dialogue Consultant for the Training Center, and we're very lucky to be joined today by Undarya Tumursukh, who will be speaking to us about promoting women's rights and training for gender equality in Mongolia. So first, allow me to explain, please, that the COP interview series features interviews with experts on topics that are related to training for gender equality. The series has been running since June, and it will go through till December. So we do a series twice a month, or one interview twice a month, for about half an hour. And during this time, whoever is listening in live will have the chance to ask questions by sending in their questions using the chat tab on the right-hand side of the WebEx platform. So without further ado, please allow me to introduce our guest for today. Undarya Tumursukh was the national coordinator of the MONFEMNET National Network, which is a leading women's rights and human rights NGO in Mongolia. She was the coordinator until 2014, and she continues as an advisor for the network, and she guides staff through leadership transition, leading new work on training curriculum development, supporting organizational development, and fundraising. Undarya has been a very prolific activist for pro-democracy, human rights, and gender equality activist in Mongolia for the past over 20 years. She's helped to found the National CEDAW Watch Network and many other amazing initiatives. She's also been very active in promoting civil society development in Mongolia more broadly through public discussions, research, analysis, advocacy on NGO legislation, solidarity and consensus building among civil society. She's also active internationally and regionally as a board member of AWID, the Association for Women's Rights and Development, and she's currently a PhD candidate at the Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand. So Undarya, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's our pleasure. So before we speak a little bit more about your work as part of the MONFEMNET Network, I'd like to know a little bit more about your personal experiences of training for gender equality. Specifically, I thought we could talk about what prompted your interest in human rights and gender equality related activism, and also how did you become to be an activist, and specifically a gender trainer?
Becoming an activist was in some ways accidental, and in 1992 we had a family friend who was visiting us in Mongolia, and she was actually a Buddhist nun, Kala, who was originally Jewish from California, but she was ordained as a Buddhist nun in Nepal, and she wandered to Mongolia, and she was very excited about the changes that was taking place. So she was walking around, meeting people, and she wandered on to then emerging independent women's organizations, specifically one called Women for Social Progress Movement, or one that became called that year in 1992. Women for Social Progress. And at the time, I was the first or second year student at the Institute of Foreign Languages, and I had some English skills, which Kala thought might be useful for this new organization, and that I could volunteer and help the organization doing translation work for them. So that's how I actually started. I was helping them with translation, and I was also helping them with interpretation when guests came, because Mongolia just opened up and many people were coming in, from all sorts of international organizations, and mostly Western organizations, but also international organizations like UN agencies, So that's how I got involved. But in 1994, I think, I got sent to Thailand, to Bangkok, for a regional Asia-Pacific Women's Conference on Women in Politics. And there it was quite confusing when they were talking about gender inequality, because we actually emerged from a socialist regime where a fairly high level of equality was achieved between men and women, and liberating women from domestic slavery was a major ideological goal for the Socialist Party state during the socialist regime. And more women were educated than men in Mongolia. Women were employed just as men were employed. So actually many of the issues that so-called developing countries, so-called third world countries, women were talking about were a bit puzzling for us. But nevertheless, some of the things that I got from there was that it is important for women to work together to improve the society. And I should also say that at the time in the early 1990s, women were forming organizations, not necessarily because they thought women per se had difficulties, challenges as women, but because they thought that Mongolian women had a lot of potential to contribute to developing this new society, humane and democratic. So the idea was to pool women's talent, wisdom, knowledge, education, and capacity, and to put it in service of social progress in Mongolia. So that was the thinking at the time. But gradually, the society was changing, and the so-called transition to market-based liberal democracy was also a transition to a very structurally unequal capitalist economic system, right? So lots of problems began emerging in this, again, so-called transition. Poverty, right? And the status of women began to decline. Violence was a major issue. Alcoholism was a major issue. Unemployment was a major issue. And for the first time, we began to see phenomena like street children, beggars on the street, which for many consultants, especially Western consultants, and maybe also consultants from the Asia Pacific that come through the international organizations, actually look normal, because that's how they see, quote unquote, a third world country. But for Mongolians, this was not normal.
Mm-hmm.
So many of these social issues needed to be addressed, and I think that's how the NGO sector also became very diverse and vibrant to try to address these issues under the new conditions of democracy, where you could, as a citizen, form your own organization without asking for permission or without being sanctioned by some formal organization, right? By government. But also, of course, there was the international ideology of supporting NGOs, and talking about how important civil society is for democratization and development. So, of course, that environment was very, very important. And I think personally I evolved through that, but also through my academic learning at Rutgers, and that was from 98 to about 2006 was when I formally left Rutgers. And there, and before then, when I was doing my master's at the Central European University, my main goal was to understand what the hell this democracy is. Right? We hear a lot about democracy, but when it comes to the nitty-gritty and very practical decisions to make, whether it is in terms of policy and law, whether it is in your personal life, what is the democratic decision to make? So I thought that I needed to understand the deeper philosophy of a humane and democratic society, and that was my main, to be a better activist, basically. I went to grad school, and at Rutgers, professors assumed that everybody wanted to pursue an academic career and to become professors. And when I said that was not my intention, one of my professors in political theory looked at me and said, "Are you a masochist? What are you doing here?" And I think that was, for me, my personal search was very much my country's search for answers to, for us, very important questions, but very confusing questions. Once you descend to, let's say, earth,
Mm-hmm.
ground, Mongolian ground, from the high level, very general discourse on democracy and human rights. And I think I became thoroughly a feminist, and I would say non-Western third world feminist while I was at Rutgers, under the influence of, many feminist scholars, non-white feminist scholars, black feminist scholars, and post-colonial, especially feminist scholars, because I saw many parallels between post-socialist Mongolia and post-colonial countries in terms of the power dynamics and in terms of how internalized our sense of backwardness is, through the discourses of whether socialist style or Western style civilizational, modernization and civilization. So ideologically, I became a feminist democratic activist, and for me, with a deeper knowledge, thanks to all the, rigorous training I received in the political science department at Radford. And as a trainer, though, becoming a trainer is a very different thing. I think I would say I became a trainer probably around 2007 when I agreed to serve as the coordinator of the Mongolian Women's NGO Network,
Mm-hmm.
Mongolian MONFEMNET National Network.
Mm-hmm.
MONFEMNET National Network. It was a fairly different organization when I assumed the role of general coordinator, national coordinator at the organization. It wasn't explicitly feminist, and it wasn't explicitly human rights based, and it wasn't looking at the challenges that we were facing in Mongolia in structural terms or systemic terms. And that's where we tried to, together with my colleagues in civil society, long-standing activists, human rights and women's rights and pro-democracy activists, that's where we tried to channel MONFEMNET National Network. So the first training we developed as MONFEMNET National Network was in late 2007, I think, if my memory serves me right. And that was about women. It was about promoting strategic communication, I think, for supporting or promoting women's political representation. And we were also very clear about emphasizing representation because in terms of participation, there was no problem. Women were very active politically. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that they wouldn't get represented equally with men, and it was still a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And we thought that we need to equip women with analytical and conceptual understanding of what is going on, So for us, that meant that women need to understand that they are functioning within a patriarchal hegemony, and that they need to see that they can redefine politics and that they can redefine power, the dominant meanings of power and the dominant meanings of politics, because those dominant meanings, man-made meanings, actually exclude women, from the political sphere as dirty, as tough, and as very difficult for women. And if women go into that, they will not, they will cease to become women, or they will become somehow corrupted. So the male politicians in Mongolia still say that let us do the dirty work. We don't want you wonderful women, getting into this dirty stuff. So we were trying to challenge those ideas and also introduce discussions about culture, and begin to talk about tradition in a constructive but also critical way.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the sort of first attempt, and we did our best. But I, as a person who was leading this process, was
Mm-hmm.
extremely apprehensive because this was the first time I was organizing a training, and
Mm-hmm.
I tried to involve people, trainers from
Mm-hmm.
the member organizations that I thought could do a good job. But at the time, my concern was maybe three things, I should say. My concern was about two things. One was we had heard this thing about participatory training, participatory workshops. And I'm thinking, because I come from an academic background, right? I'm not sure what it means to organize a participatory training. I had been to some workshops, here and there, usually in the Asia Pacific, and but I don't know. Is that the participatory training? Could it be more participatory? Are we being less participatory? And so that was one anxiety. The other anxiety was I am not really Mongolian school. in terms of language, because I went to a Russian language secondary school. Then my academic training was in my MA and my and education at Rutgers was in English. And I was anxious about conveying those complex concepts in accessible language.
Mm-hmm.
So but I was convinced that those kinds of fine analysis need to somehow make their way into the training arena. So the third one was about not just translation between English and or the Mongolian language, but about um, making complex concepts accessible, and speaking in a language that women could relate to, and not just relate to intellectually, but emotionally. So that was, those were the concerns. I didn't feel that we actually did it right. So I wasn't sure about the format. I knew the content was good, but I wasn't sure about the delivery of that content. But then the major leap we made as trainers and as organizers of training workshops was when we actually began to intensively work with youth. We supported a youth campaign from 2008 following the first post-election violence in Mongolia on July 1st, 2008.
Yes.
And as human rights activists, then we formed a coalition to document human rights abuses by the state. And our lawyers, coalition lawyers, also represented over 200 victims, just a few women lawyers, but they represented over 200 victims. And that was a very difficult process under very difficult political conditions in those times. The state of emergency was announced for 5 days. So, and we were concerned about our personal safety. But one thing that struck us most and really, really hurt our souls was to see how younger men were treated most harshly and most brutally in that skirmish, by the police, including female policemen. Police officers. So we thought that youth were more vulnerable, but we also saw that male youth were more vulnerable. And so that was one part of it. It is very important to work with youth to equip them with skills and knowledge to express their political agenda in a bold way, but in a way that will not make them more vulnerable to, say, state violence.
Mm-hmm.
That was a major goal. The other part of it was that, okay, so as feminists, of course, our focus is on women. And in Mongolia already, before intensive feminist work started, there was a gender disbalance in terms of education and social status. More women actually had higher education than men.
Yes.
And there were many single women who were older,
Mm-hmm.
and, they wanted to have partners, but there is nobody to marry. So there was this sort of social issue that we didn't want to exacerbate. And we thought that if we really want to change the society, if we want to transform the society, we need to bring the men along, not leave them behind.
Yes.
And the other part of it is that, again, theoretically, conceptually, because of my academic background, I was looking at femininity as one machinery of patriarchy and masculinity as the other. And I was convinced personally that you need to address both if you want to transform. And it is not just about liberating women from patriarchy, it is also about liberating men from patriarchy.
Yes.
From the confines of hegemonic, patriarchal masculinity. So, so involving men, and the other thing is transforming society to make it more egalitarian, more humane, more democratic shouldn't just be the responsibility of women. Everybody in the society needs to contribute their share.
Of course.
That was the thinking behind beginning more intensively the work with youth, and together with the youth, both men and women. And many of these young people also volunteered in the Human Rights Coalition after the post-election violence as well. So we had made, broader contact with young people who were committed to democracy and human rights. So the idea was to work with these youth and to guide them to understand that gender equality and inclusiveness, including LGBTIQ, not only women. It's often easy to include women, but then, those others, stay outside.
Yes.
So we wanted to be quite holistic in how we understood this humane and democratic society, to say that we need to be critical of patriarchy, we need to be critical of all other structural inequalities, and that's the intersectional perspective, and that we also need to be very aware and critical of heteronormativity and how it affects men, women, and those who don't fit in those two boxes, right? So the youth, I didn't use the word feminism because feminism was a bad word and still in many ways a bad word. And also based on my Buddhist reading, while practice, actually Mongolians are predominantly Buddhist, but there isn't a whole lot of conceptual understanding of Buddhism or ethical understanding of Buddhism per se. And that's what I got when I was reading instead of working on my political science stuff. One thing that really struck me and influenced my activism as well as as a trainer, that we shouldn't get stuck on words, because words are just signs. They're important and influential. It is important to use particular words or think about the use of words and what words you use and how you use them. But nevertheless, words or concepts are just that. They are devices, and they do not encapsulate the reality in total. And so I was aware of these words that might help the cause, might form an initial barrier to try to understand something.
Yes.
So feminism was one of those words, but I thought that we could actually work with the analysis, of feminist analysis of patriarchy, of heteronormativity, and in an intersectional, from an intersectional perspective, without using, words like that. And we actually managed to do that. But I did use the word patriarchy in a sort of Mongolianized way, even though there is an equivalent term for patriarchy in Mongolian. However, that term suggested that it was just a matter of tradition.
Okay.
Not a matter of a system. And I thought if I use the word patriarchy, we pronounce it as patriarchat. Right? So then I thought it is easier to convey that this is a system of power, that this is a system. This is not just about isolated traditions, like in family, you serve the first bowl of tea or food to the head of the household, or the head of the household is not supposed to take the trash out. So it's not just a matter of those kinds of customs and traditions, but it is a matter of a system, and this system is hegemonic. And when we say that this system is hegemonic, we mean that it is very much internalized, and it is embedded in everyday practices, and our mode of thinking, and even informs our desires, whether we are men or women. Although it will affect us differently depending on whether we're young, whether we are transgender, or whether we are men, women, living in rural areas, and so on and so on. So, how it intersects. So that was basically conceptually the analysis that we wanted to get across to young people as the basis for understanding, where we want to go in terms of promoting democracy, human rights, and equality, and how we want to create a culture. So the training from the beginning, I think, for us was very much about developing analytical skills, very much based on feminist principles, but from an intersectional perspective, from a cultural, point of view, from a systemic point of view, with a strong focus on culture and with a very strong focus on ourselves, reflecting on ourselves to look at how I am, cooperating with these structures of inequality on a daily basis. So it was about developing people's critical thinking.
Yes.
So I think that is how we saw the training. So the task was, I think that work with youth was foundational for the way MONFEMNET has done training ever since then, because I spent very intensive sessions, formally and informally, with the young people and explaining them the theories using English complex, very theoretical jargon sometimes, like hegemony.
Yes.
Because
yes.
I didn't have the Mongolian words at the time to use. And so I would explain it, draw on the whiteboard, explain it to young people. We'd have very intense discussions and, bringing down those theories to the Mongolian, context. And so my question then to the young people was, okay, now, how would you convey this content and analysis to young people like yourself in a language and in a manner that young people would understand? So, we had brainstorming sessions about different training sessions, and we came up with a fairly, for us at the time, quite innovative format. We would have maybe a quick brainstorming, like brain exercise, we call it, session, and then we would have an exercise, oftentimes like a game, that would be followed by feedback, because there would be groups usually, 2-3 groups, exercises, and then there would be feedback to the groups, and then there would be a collective discussion, an analytical discussion. So that would be one session. So as an example, we came up with an idea for the session on patriarchy and gender equality. We would start with questions, and this will be very familiar to many gender trainers, I think. It's like, so what are the criteria? How do you know somebody is a man, right? So is they grow beard and has testicles and a penis and muscles and Adam's apple or whatever, and then maybe strong and tall or whatever, right? Different kinds of characteristics. And then similar would be listed for the women. Then we ask, okay, so then the young people gather pictures from Google. So a woman with a beard, or something, a picture that would unsettle, those categories. And then we would start crossing out. So if you can't have children, for different reasons, whether you were born, barren, right? Or because you had a problem and you had your uterus removed or whatever, for different reasons you cannot bear children. So are you still a woman? So that's just to unsettle, to jog the usual thinking. But then the exercise, there are 2 kinds of exercises at the time that we came up, and I think the most exciting, although it's difficult, I think I like both of them. One of them was to rescript patriarchal fairy tales, and we basically concluded all fairy tales as patriarchal, especially the Disney ones, the ones we the European fairy tales.
Yes.
And to rescript them and to act them out, to do these little skits that would be non-patriarchal. And that was a very successful exercise, because to do that, they would take, let's say Cinderella, right? So they will take that and they would have to analyze what are the patriarchal elements in the fairy tale, right? And then they would have to work on those elements to make them non-patriarchal. And sometimes groups would come up with a matriarchal story. And then we would have, and that was good too, right? Because then we would say, so is the goal of gender equality just to reverse the power inequality? We want women to be in charge and to have all the power. Is that what we want? So we would really have, what is the meaning of gender justice? what is the meaning of gender equality. So we would have that very detailed, very deep discussion that would follow after this kind of exercise. And the other exercise is groups would get different tasks. One group would have to enact a non-patriarchal date. One group would have to enact non-patriarchal evening news, and so on. That would be followed by discussion. So that was the format. And there was also a PowerPoint presentation, actually. I forgot about that. So that was the analytical. So I think through that process, I would say I became a trainer. I didn't think of myself as a trainer until this work with youth. And I became a trainer through this very intensely participatory process,
Yes.
process with youth. And we have sought to continue that collaborative training process, and we generally had teams of trainers. And that's
Yes.
how MONFEMNET now works. There is never one trainer. There may be somebody who is the lead trainer, who will support other trainers when necessary, but we always form training teams. For us, that teamwork is very important because that in itself is education for participants. Because
Of course.
one of the key values and principles and also skills that we want to say is egalitarianism, right? So if that's what we want in a society, that's what we need to carry as much as we can, carry through the training process. So that means being very sensitive of power inequalities within the training team and between trainers and participants, and try to bring all of the people involved in training closer, right? Try to level. And we use different means to do that. And I would say one of the main means is humor.
Excellent.
Telling silly jokes, people will come in and we will, joke with them and chat. I realized afterwards, I was doing all of this instinctively. I wasn't really strategically using humor initially. Later on, I realized humor is one of our strategies. And it comes quite natural to us because, I think every people has their natural sense of humor, Mongolians have a sense of humor. But they don't bring it to trainings because the dominant idea and also, the socialist legacy of thinking of trainings is that it is something very serious. Right? So we try to subvert, I guess, we try to unsettle sorts of preconceptions, including about training and knowledge bearers, and we have a process of collective production of knowledge.
Yes.
I think that was a very long stretch, so I should give you a chance to ask a different question.
That was an excellent answer. I've never heard such a good answer and such an excellent example of participatory training and collaborative knowledge production. And just this idea, I think the reflexivity that you talk about between the training team is such an inspiring thing and something that many trainers tend to maybe not forget, but maybe it's not emphasized as much as it should be. And especially the idea that if we're promoting critical thinking and we're trying to transform really by subverting norms and by subverting stereotypes and by subverting these systems, hegemonic systems of, power imbalance, that I think humor gets left behind, and it really shouldn't be, because that is an excellent way of, breaking the ice between people. And I think participants, if they feel comfortable and they feel willing enough to laugh and to share that experience, I think that's a really wonderful method of bringing people out of their shells and getting them to think about issues critically. And I think I'm just really bowled over. It's such an inspiring transformational process, and I think it sounds like a great transformational process both for you personally and for the network, and also, I'm sure, for the participants, So I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about that, and maybe we could, if you have any particular story that maybe sticks out in your mind, where either you or a participant or maybe a fellow trainer, where you sort of saw or you really appreciated that this was a transformational moment or a transformational time for them. I wonder if you have any particular experience of that.
Oh my God, many. And but it's very difficult to choose because this is what drives us, despite
Of course.
difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
And there's high level of leadership burnout, chronic underfunding,
Mm-hmm.
and very deep-seated exploitative attitude towards NGOs, right? And
Mm-hmm.
women-led NGOs in particular. So
Mm-hmm.
despite all of that, and that is injustice, and I think women are exploited through the NGO sector. I really have begun to see that as a very neo-colonial patriarchal exercise.
Mm-hmm.
Especially, when given I've had 3 years to think about, reflect back on, why is it that after over 20 years of existence and fairly successful existence, I'm so worried about the fragility of the organizations. Why is it that our organizations are so fragile, and why is it that practically all the long-term leaders have very serious physical problems, health issues?
Mm-hmm.
If we are talking about literal breakdown, I'm not even talking about nervous breakdown. I'm talking about bodily breakdown. So despite all of that, what drives us is precisely that we see how important and valuable our work is, and especially, not only, but especially through these quote-unquote training processes. And I should also say, maybe before we go further, that we distinguish between training and workshops. There are actually no words for workshops in Mongolian, but
Mm-hmm.
they are called trainings, and it's a misnomer. I think we do,
Okay.
in fact, probably different types of workshops, and some of them will be more like training in terms of focus on knowledge and skills, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas most of our workshops, let's say on masculinities, transforming masculinity for gender justice, or for the youth, or for women, including women local politicians, and with communities, with
Mm-hmm.
community members, with grassroots, they're really about creating a safe space and equipping them with some analytical tools to engage
Mm-hmm.
in a deeply reflective process, including self-reflection and collective reflection.
Mm-hmm.
Rethinking a lot of things. So it's about sharing our experiences and knowledge and learning from each other, and it is about constructing um, analysis together, and
Mm-hmm.
developing critical knowledge together. So I think these, and whether you call them training or not, I don't really think they are trainings per se.
Mm-hmm.
So I think for us as trainers, people who've been leading this training process, for us there was a very deep personal process of rethinking
Mm-hmm.
uh, the workshops. What are the workshops? Initially, we started, from a place where we thought, okay, so we bring people together, they're participants, and the onus is on us to have the knowledge, and it
Mm-hmm.
has to be complete and high quality knowledge, which we transfer to the participants,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the problematic was to have that knowledge. But how many of us have that level of arrogance? To think that, oh yes, I am an expert, so I have the authority, right, to
Mm-hmm.
convey this knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how we started out thinking what the workshops were, and we were constantly worried whether we had that authoritative knowledge. So
Mm-hmm.
then we shifted to a very different understanding of workshops as spaces that are egalitarian, and
Mhm.
spaces where all of us, trainers and participants, are learners,
Mhm.
right? And that was a liberating process, I have to
Mhm.
say. And there I have a story of my colleague who is a very well-regarded um, feminist activist
Mhm.
in Mongolia, Inkchagal, and she and I were master trainers uh, for, well, we called ourselves master trainers for a new training program that we were developing on promoting women's political representation and participation.
Mhm.
She, and she was very worried that she doesn't have enough knowledge to develop the content with me. So I said, and all of us
Mhm.
have been overworked, right? Completely underfunded and completely overworked. So actually, one of the challenges is that we don't have the time. You know, we don't have so much time to sit and read around, and many of us have problems with language because there isn't much in Mongolian. And if you don't have access to
Mhm.
English and you don't have English skills, then it's very difficult actually to do this training work, right? To develop training content,
Mhm.
lots of ingredients need to go in, and one of it today in this globalized democratizing context in Mongolia is comparative research, right?
Mhm.
So, and of course, you also have to know very well your local or national context, and then skills and commitment to principles and values and so on. So I told her that don't worry. I also don't know because we have planned this topic, and of course, some of them we know more or less, and some of them were new, but we wanted to do those new things. We wanted to develop that new content. I said, we will do it together, and we will approach the program development, the content development, and methodology development as a process to engage in together with the trainers, because initially the plan was we would train 10 women under 30 and 10 women over 30 to be trainers. And then teams of 2 younger trainers and 2 older trainers would travel to the provinces and hold uh, local workshops, for local participants. And in parallel, the older trainers for older women, younger trainers for younger women, but all of them would come together for the last day. And
Mhm.
purpose to bring the young people along with us and to break down age hierarchies, to
Mhm.
promote youth activism, and to promote the movement. And there is no movement without intergenerational solidarity, and there is no
Mhm.
movement without young people. That was our thinking. So we did, and we held sessions with the trainers, with the 20 trainers, and we discussed the content. Then we brainstormed about exercises, the methodology part, and we came up with a fairly well-developed training program, with the content and with the methodology through that participatory process. And
Mhm.
then my friend, my colleagues said that she felt like a huge burden fell off her shoulders. She no longer felt that she had to know everything,
Mhm.
before she steps in as a trainer. She felt that, it's okay if I don't know, but maybe we will achieve greater degree of insight through the cooperative process, through the collaborative process, and through the process of collective knowledge production, collective analysis. So I think that
Yes.
was also a turning point in maybe around 2010.
Mhm. That sounds like an excellent transformational moment. It really feels like it's everything you're saying it strikes me as just really embodying all these feminist principles that we say should guide training. And I feel like everything you've said so far is such a reflection of how to put these principles into practice. This idea of solidarity and this idea of, moving away from hierarchical knowledge production and and this difference which seems to persist in spite of the idea of applying feminist principles to training for gender equality. The idea seems to persist that the trainer must be sort of a repository of knowledge and the guardian of all knowledge and is, in charge of transferring this knowledge. But I think that's what you're saying is an excellent example of the fact that trainers are not infallible and trainers are not in charge of any knowledge which is, hierarchically superior to the trainees. And I think that's one thing that is such a kernel of training for gender equality, which you embody completely, which is, the idea that knowledge needs to be produced collectively and there is no hierarchy, and a trainer can learn just as much from a training as any trainee. And I think that's a really excellent example of that.
I think the training or workshops that we have facilitated, and that's the other point as well, we have moved from the notion of trainer to the notion of facilitator.
Mm-hmm.
We also try to constantly involve new facilitators. And many people are afraid, especially women, because women tend not to be as arrogant, and we tend to have a lot of self-doubt,
Mm-hmm.
and, because we are women in patriarchal context. So the participation as a facilitator, participation as a trainer is in itself very empowering, but
Mm-hmm.
also very humbling. Once you begin to think of the workshop process as a collaborative knowledge production and collective analysis and collective reflection,
Mm-hmm.
in a safe environment, right? That safety is very important, and how you
Mm-hmm.
achieve safety is by being kind, right? Kind, open, and
Mm-hmm.
honest with each other, and also making people feel comfortable. And that
Mm-hmm.
goes back to humor as well. So we use humor, and we also dance. I love dancing, so that was a fairly self-interested thing to start doing. Salsa, but nobody at the time.
Fantastic.
There were no salsa clubs really, But I wanted
Mm-hmm.
to spread my love of, Latin American music and
Mm-hmm.
salsa to more people, and then maybe we can go to salsa parties,
Fun.
But I realized actually, and I wasn't sure that other people appreciated, but then we tried it, and one participant said, male participant, I think it was one of the masculinity workshops, he said, "This is really great. I came here thinking that I will just receive knowledge, but I actually also learned another new skill,
Mm-hmm.
different. So people really appreciated learning different things,
Mm-hmm.
and also feeling energized,
Mm-hmm.
and really be feeling charged with
Mm-hmm.
positive energy, so that creating that atmosphere and mutual trust and that openness is a very, very important part of, the workshop or training process. And I think that also needs to be emphasized. And one of the things that, there are lots of things that we learned, I personally learned from the process and from the participants, from other trainers. But I should say one moment was, especially when we were holding, whether it was a youth training or masculinities, but there were several young men
Mm-hmm.
in the early 20s. And we were talking about nationalism,
Mm-hmm.
ethno-nationalism, which is very misogynistic, sexist, and focused on controlling women's bodies, sexualities. And we learned very, very important things from those young men.
Mm-hmm.
How this whole nationalism thing works, and also bullying,
Mm-hmm.
socialization into domineering, aggressive masculinity in a
Mm-hmm.
very specific context. And as older women, that is something that we would never find out.
Mm-hmm.
If we hadn't involved young people,
Mm-hmm.
including young men, but also if we had a top-down style of training, those
Mm-hmm.
stories wouldn't come out. It's amazing how much valuable experience everybody has, and that is something that we have
Mm-hmm.
really understood through this process and came to value.
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent. That's wonderful. I think this knowledge production and collective knowledge production, just learning through experience and learning through these kinds of experiences from each other is such a strong point. And I wonder if this is related at all. Before we started the interview, you mentioned, related to your academic work, the idea of labor activism. And I wonder if we could touch on that as well, because I think that's related, and it's such an interesting concept. And I'd really like, maybe you could explain a little bit about what you see that as.
So, in the Mongolian context, civil society was thought to be, in the first 20 years, as vibrant and led by women, and some people even called Mongolian civil society matriarchal, and that was regaled by um, outsiders, scholars and non-scholars alike, but also at times, at strategic times, by our own male leaders, political leaders, as a sign of how democratic Mongolia is and how empowered Mongolian women are. However, as I said, that I came to New Zealand 3 years ago completely broken down in body and in spirit. After very intense years of activism, and I look around, and my colleagues are in similar space. So I began to ask myself, why is it? Are we really strong or not? If Mongolian women are empowered, then we shouldn't. Then our organization should be strong enough, to provide for fairly sustainable leadership transition, to be able to repay the staff that we spend so much energy on training, right? And we also shouldn't have to knock on the same doors every time government shifts.
Yes.
So I felt like there's so much effort that we spend, and I realized it's because we don't really have power. We don't have resources, we don't have money, and we don't have direct political power to influence policy. So we are constantly on the outside, and we have also chosen to be outside, and that goes back to our own embracing of the neoliberal democratic ideology, of the glorification of civil society and NGOs, of being independent of the government. So civil society made space for women who were concerned about society on the ground. And we spent all our energies within the space. But then I began to realize this is a very confined and under-resourced sector. So there are pros and cons of being an activist. And I wonder if our goals would have been served better had we chosen to channel our energies into political parties, and thereby take some of the direct political power, so we don't have to depend on men who actually don't have our interests at heart, and who don't share our goals and our vision for the humane and democratic society. So that's how I began to conceptualize my research, and I went back home at the end of 2015 to gather data for fieldwork. And I had research workshops with my colleagues, and then I also interviewed a number of people outside of our immediate activist circle, and I realized something. Our work is invisible to most people. Only some of our work is visible and public and regaled sometimes or criticized harshly. However, the more intense work we do, for example, in these workshops, the deep thinking that goes into, and the energy, that goes into developing the training curriculum, let's say, and then, the hours and hours of consultation, of reflection that goes into, and then the preparation for the workshop, and the workshop process itself, and then maintaining relations with the participants or organizations, and so on and so on. I mean, there's so many things that we do as activists, and that labor is unpaid. Very little of that labor is paid, and when paid, paid very poorly. The cost of our activist labor is unseen because we don't talk about it. Even we don't recognize that it is labor. Right? The consultations or the thinking or the emotional labor that we do,
Mhm.
the spiritual labor that we do, it is invisible and therefore not acknowledged.
Mhm.
So I think that it is important for us to make that labor visible because
Yes.
it seems to be the only way we can make it valuable,
Mhm.
you know, to I should say it is extremely valuable but not valued,
Mhm.
and when valued, undervalued. And
This
this is
sounds
hmm?
no, sorry. This sounds very much just in general about women's. There seems to be such a parallel with women's unpaid care work that really strikes me very strongly here.
Absolutely. And I see very strong parallels there because the unpaid care work is under the glorification of love, right?
Yes.
Women are supposed to, um, women are said to be so loving and caring, and love and care are such valuable things you can't put a price tag on it,
Mhm.
and it's something to be given freely. Um, and but then care work is actually labor.
Yes.
Care work is now industry.
Mhm.
You know, it is industry where some people benefit and some people benefit less, and some people don't. And it is an industry within which there is significant exploitation.
Mhm.
And this exploitation is boiled through this, rhetoric of care and love and association of that with women within a patriarchal ideology. And I began to see regaling of civil society and NGOs in a similar fashion.
Mhm.
You know, of course, there is value to civil society and NGOs, but we need to think through uh, this, how would you say, narrative,
Yes.
discourse, very,
Mhm.
very carefully to see clearly how women are actually being exploited
Mhm.
by international development organizations, by states, by other parties, and by other NGOs, including international NGOs or bigger national NGOs.
Mhm.
And it is overwhelmingly women's labor.
Mhm.
I see. I think not only in Mongolia.
I think this also draws a bit of parallels in general because gender trainers tend to be activists as well. And I think this is a very relevant concern, I think, also for gender trainers because it tends to be a sector that is predominantly dominated by women, and much of the work tends to be invisible. And but not only, we spoke as part of the interview series to one of your colleagues from Mongolia, Otko, and it was such a pleasure to speak to him. And I think he also raised similar points about it being, like the idea that we're trying to make training and trainers and activism and women's work and the work that people do that tends to be, ignored or undervalued or completely not valued at all, despite how valuable it is, to bring it out from the shadows essentially and to make it more visible and to take stock of the fact that we need to think critically about how we are treating this kind of work. And I think one of the things that speakers like you, who are so wonderful, have really brought out in this COP interview series, is that training is a very valuable process, and it's very enriching, and it is really transformative. And for that reason, it has a great deal of value. And I think I've enjoyed speaking to you so much. And we're going to go over the hour in a little bit, but I just wanted to end with if you have any other further comments to make, because it's been such a fascinating interview, and I want to thank you so much for being with us today and for your expertise and for your insights and for sharing your wonderful experiences and your knowledge. And do you have any other like maybe parting words for our listeners? Hmm?
Yes, I would like to end with something that another colleague, trainer, Miss Tendayush, human rights lawyer, said that she one thing that inspires her to go on and travel long distances to rural areas and do the training is that she sees women's eyes begin to sparkle, and she says that it happens more slowly in some localities and faster in other localities, but it always happens as a result of our training workshops. And she says when she sees that light, that sparkle in women's eyes, and she sees that transformation through their eyes, that's why she goes back, and that's why she stays, as an activist trainer.
I think that's the most beautiful message we could possibly have ever ended on. Thank you very much, Undarya. So let's hope that this has, I'm sure, inspired everyone who's listened, and I'm sure everyone has a sparkle in their eye and is inspired to transform and continue to look at training as this transformative process that really has this power to make people light up in a way that is a truly wonderful thing. So I want to end on that note and just thank you so much for being our speaker today, and it was wonderful. For everyone who listened in, thank you very much for being here, and we're going to post this interview on our YouTube channel, the Training Center's YouTube channel, so it will be available and you can disseminate and re-listen to it. And yes, thank you so much, Undarya. So I wish everyone a really wonderful day. Thank you so much.